on this, and then we'll have time for some questions. Okay. To begin with, what are we talking about when we use the terms CLI and learning transfer? First, CLI, which is also commonly called language transfer, is typically defined as the influence that knowledge of one language has on an individual's learning or use of a different language. For example, if I, as a native speaker of English, try to learn Spanish, my pronunciation of Spanish words might sound like my pronunciation of English words. Or I might combine Spanish words using English word order. Those are just a couple of examples. In these cases, CLI is occurring because my knowledge of English is influencing my learning or use of Spanish. CLI has been one of the central topics of research interest in literature related to second language learning. So there's a huge body of research on this topic, and this research has examined CLI in terms of lexy, morphology, syntax, phonology, reading and writing skills, and even gestures and attitudes towards using various language skills. Learning transfer, on the other hand, is defined as the influence that prior learning has on subsequent learning or performance. For example, learning transfer is what occurs when an individual who can drive a car then drives a truck for the first time. Although the vehicles are different, the individual is able to drive the truck by applying skills learned from driving cars. Another example of learning transfer is when children apply lessons learned from school when they're out in the real world. For example, kids might apply lessons learned from a math class to deal with money when they go shopping. Learning transfer has been of central interest in psychology, education, and human resources development. And the body of research and theory on this topic is also massive and extends back over a century. Now here's a point that's central to the argument that I'm trying to make today. As these definitions show, CLI and learning transfer both refer to the application of knowledge and skills in novel situations. With CLI, the knowledge and skills are language related, and the novel situation is an individual's learning or use of a different language. With learning transfer, the knowledge, skills, and novel situation can be related to any domain, not just language use. So the key point here is that, conceptually speaking, CLI appears to be one specific kind of learning transfer. Now, if CLI is a kind of learning transfer, it would make sense to see connections to learning transfer research and theory in literature dealing with CLI. But such connections seem to be kind of uncommon. Now that doesn't mean that there are no connections. Here's a list of connections that I have found, and this includes, for example, statements that CLI research evolved from research on learning transfer. Also references to learning transfer theory in discussions about how language teachers might address CLI, as well as statements that some aspects of learning transfer theory might be relevant to CLI. But generally speaking, these connections tend to be either relatively superficial or outdated. And besides these connections listed up here, mention of learning transfer in literature dealing with CLI appears to be rare. So because of the conceptual relationship between CLI and learning transfer, this scarcity of connections seems kind of puzzling. So I took a closer look at the research literature on CLI and the research literature on learning transfer to see if I could understand more about the relationship and perhaps figure out why the connections are uncommon. What I found first was that the conceptual relationship between CLI and learning transfer actually goes deeper, because some of the factors that impact CLI also impact learning transfer. Here's the list of factors that I'm talking about, and I'll describe each one briefly. One factor that has featured prominently in explanations of CLI is individuals' perceptions of cross-linguistic similarity. Researchers point out that CLI is more likely to occur when an individual perceives some kind of similarity between a first language and a second language. And it's less likely to occur when an individual does not perceive any similarity between those languages. And this is usually the case regardless of any objective similarity between the languages. Interestingly, perceptions of similarity are also important to learning transfer. Because research shows that learning transfer is more likely to occur when an individual perceives some kind of similarity between two situations. And it's less likely to occur when an individual does not perceive any similarity between those two situations. The second factor, a second factor that's believed to impact CLI is proficiency. Researchers have pointed out that the greater an individual's proficiency in one language, the more likely it is that that language will influence the learning or use of another language. A parallel point has been made about learning transfer, where researchers have suggested that the greater the size and depth of an individual's knowledge base, the more able that individual is to make connections that lead to learning transfer. Knowledge base and language proficiency are parallel, at least I see them as parallel, in the sense that both have to do with an individual's cumulative knowledge and skills. Number 3. A third factor that's been identified as impacting CLI is motivation. Although this factor has received relatively little attention, researchers have pointed out that motivation is one of the non-linguistic factors that can impact CLI. As for learning transfer, motivation has been identified as important here too. For example, researchers have highlighted motivation as part of an individual's disposition toward learning transfer. And they've suggested that without a positive disposition, learning transfer is less likely to occur. Number 4. A fourth factor that influences CLI is interlocutor characteristics. Researchers have pointed out that individuals' use of a second language can vary depending on the characteristics of an interlocutor. For example, an individual's pronunciation of a second language may be more target-like when speaking with native speakers of that second language, and less target-like when speaking with other non-native speakers of that second language. As for how this relates to learning transfer, interlocutor characteristics can be seen as part of a sociocultural context. And sociocultural context is another factor that is believed to impact learning transfer. Research suggests that learning transfer is more likely when an individual believes that the sociocultural context supports transfer. For example, when other people around them, like friends or coworkers or supervisors, actually value such transfer. And number 5, the final factor listed here as impacting CLI is automaticity. Researchers explain that CLI can be seen as the activation of skills that are highly automatized and that are used without any conscious control. And for language skills to develop to that point requires extensive practice. This is the overlap with learning transfer, where amount and type of practice is seen as an important factor. Researchers here have pointed out that one of the main reasons that learning transfer might fail is due to insufficient practice using the knowledge or skills in question. So this list of overlapping factors, it doesn't mean that there are no differences between the two constructs in terms of factors that influence them. Explanations of CLI include factors that are specific to the domain of language use. And these don't easily equate with factors in other domains where learning transfer might occur. For example, some CLI research has studied the impact of linguistic context by looking at how the letters or the words or the sounds before and after a particular language feature might impact CLI with that feature. Despite any differences, though, the points of overlap discussed here are significant and support the idea that CLI is a kind of learning transfer. Besides uncovering some of the depth of the relationship between CLI and learning transfer, I also found that there had been some explicit avoidance of connections to learning transfer in CLI literature. Learning transfer has roots in behavioral psychology, which is a school of thought on human behavior that became widely discredited in the middle of the 20th century. This association with behavioral psychology was seen as problematic by some researchers studying CLI. And this quote illustrates some of the reasons why it was seen as problematic. For example, the laboratory research designs that were typical of experimental behavioral psychology were seen as very rigid and maybe too precise, and as involving learning that was too superficial to be relevant to complex language behavior. But in looking closely at the literature on CLI and the literature on learning transfer, we can see at least 3 good reasons why these arguments for viewing learning transfer as different from CLI are less compelling now than they might have been in the past. The first reason has to do with the idea that learning transfer research is associated with behavioral psychology. The fact is that although a behavioral psychology perspective was common in early research and theory on learning transfer, this isn't the only perspective that has been taken. Learning transfer has also been examined from Gestalt, cognitive, and sociocultural psychology perspectives. For example, a Gestalt perspective has been used to explain learning transfer that occurs in the absence of obvious similarities between situations. This is very different from the stimulus-response situations that behavioral psychologists were interested in, identical situations. Learning transfer is explained from a Gestalt perspective as having to do with an individual's understanding of abstract general principles, which the individual is then able to apply in various situations that are or are not similar to the original situation. Also, a cognitive perspective has been used to examine learning transfer in terms of the inner workings of the human mind, which contrasts sharply with the behavioral psychology focus on external observable behavior. From a cognitive perspective, learning transfer has to do with internal mental processes, like how knowledge is represented in the mind. Much of the research on learning transfer in the last 30 years, most of the research, has taken a cognitive psychology perspective. And finally, a sociocultural perspective has been used to expand the scope of research on learning transfer. Rather than studying learning transfer in only narrow, decontextualized tasks, researchers from this perspective have examined learning transfer in more complex, real-world contexts. For example, much of the research on learning transfer in human resources development settings has taken a sociocultural perspective, focusing on the way that support from coworkers and supervisors can influence transfer of learning from workplace training back to the workplace. So the main point here, is that learning transfer research and theory has not been limited to a behavioral psychology perspective. The second reason has to do with the idea that the knowledge and skills focused on in learning transfer research are not relevant to complex language behavior. That's the earlier claim. It's true that research on learning transfer has examined learning outcomes that don't seem relevant to language use. And this includes studies of physical skills like typing, or visual perception of colors, or memorization of lists of numbers. But learning transfer research has also examined learning outcomes that do seem more relevant to language use. And here is a list of language-related learning outcomes that have been the focus of recent research on learning transfer. This includes knowledge of vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, listening perception, phonological awareness, reading skills and strategies, and writing skills and strategies. For example, in one of the studies at the bottom of this list, by Alls, 2003, the researcher created a 7th grade reading and writing curriculum that taught students strategies such as how to categorize ideas in a text as either general or specific, and how to write a paragraph. The study then examined whether learning outcomes from the new curriculum transferred to compositions written in different subjects in the 7th and 8th grades. So looking again at the complete list, the learning outcomes studied in this research parallel to at least some degree learning outcomes focused on in studies of CLI. The third reason has to do with the idea that in learning transfer research, the learning involved is superficial compared to the deep learning of a first language associated with CLI research. A problem with this idea, though, is that research on CLI itself has evolved, such that it's no longer restricted to studying only deeply learned aspects of a first language. Although CLI is often viewed as the influence of an individual's first language on second language learning and use, current definitions of CLI tend to be broader and also include the influence of a second language on the learning and use of a third language or a fourth language, as well as the influence of a second language on first language use. So, if the source of CLI is a second language, the learning involved may not necessarily be deep, not as deep as a first language. So these are 3 reasons. The last 3 slides are 3 reasons why arguments for a divergence of scholarly work on CLI from scholarly work on learning transfer are less convincing now than they might have been in the past. With this in mind, research and theory on learning transfer might be considered as a source of information and ideas for research and theory on CLI. I'll spend the next few minutes, I've got about 5 more minutes, talking about different ways that this might happen. 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 One way that constructive connections might be made is by looking to learning transfer theory for help in answering questions already raised about CLI. For example, a persistent question about CLI has to do with how individuals identify cross-linguistic similarities. Possible answers might be found in learning transfer theory that has offered neurological explanations for how individuals identify similarities. For example, the idea has been put forth that the human brain is actually hardwired with a kind of harmonic structure that allows it to recognize similar relationships in situations when there are no concrete overlapping elements. And that's how we're able to recognize a new song, recognize a song when it's played in a key higher or lower than what we're used to. The new notes that we're hearing don't actually overlap with the original song that we've heard before, but our brain recognizes the relationships between notes in the new version of the song, and the similarity between that and the relationships between notes in the earlier version of the song. That's just one example of explanations that have been offered for learning transfer that might be explored as they relate to CLI. Another way constructive connections might be made is by looking to learning transfer research for new questions worth exploring about CLI. One source of new questions is learning transfer studies that examined language-related outcomes. We might ask if factors salient in those studies are also relevant to CLI. For example, in one learning transfer study that focused on reading skills, researchers found that training students to analyze compare-contrast expository texts had a positive influence when they later analyzed other texts with the same kind of structure, compare-contrast expository texts. But this influence did not extend to texts that had a different structure, like a pro-con expository structure. So this raises an interesting question that might be asked about CLI. If the transfer of reading strategies across first language situations is constrained by similarity in genre, or the text structure, would the transfer of those same reading strategies to second language situations also be constrained by similarity in genre? New questions might also come by looking at some of the topics that have been of interest to learning transfer researchers and seeing if these might be looked at more closely in CLI research. For example, I mentioned earlier that both motivation and sociocultural context have been identified as factors that can impact CLI. But the attention paid to these two factors in CLI research is still quite limited. In learning transfer research, on the other hand, both factors have received more attention. Motivation, for example, has been highlighted as a very important factor. And it has been a focus in studies of the transfer of various learning outcomes. To apply this to the study of CLI, research might be carried out to examine in detail the role that an individual's motivation plays. For example, is CLI more likely if an individual feels motivated to make use of existing first language knowledge and skills in second language use situations? Or is CLI less likely if an individual feels motivated to avoid such use? And like motivation, sociocultural context is also seen as a very important factor related to learning transfer. For example, quite a few studies have focused on something called transfer climate, which is the support for learning transfer that an individual perceives in a given situation. The idea is that learning transfer is more likely when there's a positive transfer climate. For example, when an individual feels that the people around him or her support learning transfer. To apply this to the study of CLI, research might be carried out to examine in more detail the role that sociocultural context plays. For example, might CLI be more likely in some cases if there's a positive transfer climate? Perhaps when an individual feels like she or he is being encouraged to make use of existing first language knowledge and skills? And is CLI less likely if there's a negative transfer climate? These are just some of the questions that might emerge from a careful look at learning transfer research and theory, and that might help shed more light on CLI. And here's my conclusion. So to summarize, the purpose of this presentation was to examine the relationship between CLI and learning transfer, two constructs that appear on the surface to be similar. This is a worthwhile task because each construct has been and continues to be the subject of extensive research and theory. Yet there appear to be relatively few explicit, constructive links to scholarly work on learning transfer in literature dealing with CLI. A central point made here was that the relationship between these constructs is more than superficial. CLI can be seen as one kind of learning transfer. Besides making sense conceptually, this point is supported by overlap in factors that influence CLI and learning transfer. I also suggested that, due to research developments related to each construct, arguments made in the past for a divergence of research on CLI from research on learning transfer are less convincing now. And as a result, fruitful connections to learning transfer research and theory can be made in scholarly work on CLI. And that's it. So I'll put some references up on the screen, and you guys have them in your handouts as well. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you. Okay, yeah.
I was just wondering if you could identify any specific studies which deal with the influence of an L2 on L1 youth, especially on any which deal with younger children.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a neat one that I found, and I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce the name properly, but is it on the list here? Let's have a look. I thought I put that one up there. I think it's Keshkes and Pap, 2000. Is anyone familiar with this one? Yeah? And that was a study looking at high school students who I think were Hungarian first language speakers, and they were learning English, Russian, and French as a second language. And the researchers were interested in the impact of different models of instruction. So the students were in, some were in an immersion, a full immersion context. Some were in what they called an intensive, non-immersion intensive context, where they were studying like 7 or 8 hours a week. And other students were in like 1 or 2 hours a week, what they were calling like a standard context. And the researchers were interested in what influence that had, studying these second languages in these different formats, on their first language use. And they found that there was an impact. They found that the students in the more intensive models, the immersion and the intensive non-immersion model, there was a difference in their first language writing after they'd been studying, compared to the students who were in the standard, who were studying the second language in the standard model. And I don't. Can anyone see that on there? It's the last name begins with K. It's Keckskes. I thought I had that on there. J-K. No, I guess not. No. But I'd be happy to, if you send me an email, my email address should be on the handout, right? I'd be happy to let you know what that is, yeah. That was a very interesting one. That's a book rather than an actual journal article.
I was just wondering in terms of the influence on writing.
Yeah.
At what level, I think
I don't remember. No, sorry. Yeah. But they reported that there was an influence, statistically significant influence. Yeah, no problem. John, yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
It's a very wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I wonder, pedagogically speaking, I think this research is very useful, as you indicated earlier in the differential of the concept. The CLI, and this seems like more at a subconscious level. I wonder if you look at it from the formality perspective, the transfer of learning seems more associated at a conscious, explicitly relate to maybe personal motivation, as you indicated, and also as well as the instruction related. So I wonder if you have any feedback related to the pedagogical significance applied to this kind of research.
But I think that's an important observation, because learning transfer research, there's definitely a conscious element to it. Researchers have been interested in the conscious side of things, but researchers are interested in the unconscious side as well. And there's a well-known model of learning transfer, and that is on here. So element OP. These guys, Perkins and Salomon, in one of their other papers, they published a very important, influential model of learning transfer, where they divided it into these two branches: conscious learning transfer and unconscious. So actually, yeah. I would change what you're saying, because learning transfer is not only conscious. They definitely look at it as conscious and unconscious, but seeing those as sort of two complementary types of learning transfer. And on the other side, with CLI, yeah, it seems like most of the research has looked at it in terms of an unconscious automatic process. But see, that's one of the interesting questions I think that we could explore. If these constructs, if these phenomena do overlap, if they're related like I think they are, then maybe we should be asking questions about CLI in the same way that we're asking questions about learning transfer. Maybe it's not only automatic. And one idea that comes to mind, we don't talk about it as language, as CLI, I don't think, but code switching. Code switching, we're using the first language in second language use situations, and that might be very conscious in some situations, right? And that might be parallel to the conscious learning transfer. So I think there are some interesting connections to be made. Yeah. Please, yeah.
Well, first, I think it's really refreshing that you are relating all these CLI studies with the cognitive and the Gestalt and the social cultural psychology, which have these impeccable methodologies that we could learn a lot from.
It's interesting stuff, yeah.
I wanted to thank you for. And
Thank you.
the second one is that my dissertation does offer you some data on one aspect of motivation, which is interest on the foreign language culture and the production of CLIs. I mean, they are statistically related.
That's interesting, right? So that overlaps with some of the stuff we're talking about here with motivation, right? Oh, that's very interesting, right?
Not only like I have English L1, French L2, and Spanish L3, and the level of interest in French is positively correlated with a higher amount of French CLI. While the level of interest in Spanish is negatively correlated with the number of code switches with DO.
That's interesting.
So it blocks it.
Wow. Yeah. Well, this is the kind of stuff. There doesn't seem to be a lot published on looking at motivation and CLI, and I found just a couple of references to it. The Keshkes and Pap study that I was referring to when I was speaking to the first questioner, they mentioned motivation as being an important factor in that study of junior high school students.
What aspect of
You know what? They didn't get into it in enough detail. So I think we need, but they said that it is important. And going way back to one of the early publications on CLI by Weinrich in 1953, I think, he mentioned attitudes and motivation as being relevant. But again, didn't get into any detail. Talked about it as a non-linguistic factor that he thinks is relevant to this. So I think we need to see more empirical, hopefully more empirical work like what you're doing. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Please, yeah.
I think it's great to clarify core concepts like this. So again, I that.
Thank you.
But I'm thinking about one more use of the word transfer to come that might enter into this. And it's Jim Cummins' use of transfer. As transfer of CAAL from L1 to L2, common underlying proficiency. I'm not sure how that fits into that. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, and in fact, because of the constraints of a presentation, I couldn't get into as much detail as I'd like to, but I wrote up, this presentation is based on a paper that I wrote up, and it hasn't been published or anything yet, but I got to go into a lot more detail on this issue, and I get into this kind of stuff, looking at some of the I don't see these as explicit links to the learning transfer theory that I'm interested in, but there are certainly there's an element in second language education literature of talking about Jim Cummins' work, and there were a few others as well where they're talking about something more general, not just first language to second language, but there's something more general happening, like more general cognitive skills that are being applied in first and second language situations. And I think that's just another example of the connection between these two constructs that might make them, in actuality, these might be the same sort of thing that's happening. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.